Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast with Joe Champion, the pastor at Celebration Church in Austin, Texas, is brought to you by Compassion International. Why should we focus on releasing children from poverty? That's a question that a lot of people might ask when they hear us talking about Compassion International on this podcast. And listen, first of all, we're grateful to have Compassion as partners, as sponsors here on the podcast. But why should we focus on releasing children from poverty? Well, childhood should be full of exploration, learning, and growth, right? But children in poverty are often focused simply on just living day to day. We're talking about safe water, education, medical care, and even safe housing. And often for these children, it's substandard or even non-existent, resulting in malnutrition, child labor, abuse, and hopelessness. It's that vicious cycle of poverty that's so difficult, but can be broken. And that's where Compassion International comes in. With over 66 years of experience, Compassion has found the most effective way to care for children in need, and that is through the local church. And that's why they partner with more than 7,000 local churches in 25 countries to deliver God's love and care to children in need, one child at a time. Here's where you come in. You can help sponsor a child and release them from poverty. $38 a month. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Compassion.com/sportspectrum. Today, more than 2 million children, 2 million, are breaking the cycle of poverty for good through the work being done at Compassion International. Get involved. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Make a lasting impact on a child's life by sponsoring them today. Today's guest on the podcast is Joe Champion, the pastor at Celebration Church in Austin, Texas. And I really love talking to Joe Champion because he's not just a pastor, he's a guy that knows the game of football and has been around it for a very long time. He played football at LSU, but his dad was a coach both in the CFL and the NFL for many, many years, and Joe was a part of all of that. He shares a story on this podcast that was one of my favorite maybe I've ever heard on this podcast about how he came to faith in Christ at an NFL training camp that he was at as a ball boy in 1978 under his dad. And NFL players, a couple of them, invited Joe. Well, let's just let you listen to the podcast on how it came about. But let's just say he was 14 years old, a ball boy at training camp, and somehow that day, that time, was a moment where he came to faith in Christ. It's pretty awesome. Joe Champion's our guest, and he also planted the church and founded the church, Celebration Church, in October of 2000 in Austin, Texas. Storytelling at its best here. It's why he's a great communicator, and we're grateful to have Joe Champion here on the podcast. Take a listen. Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jason, good to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast. And I know you're in Austin, Texas, and your roots go back to LSU, actually, as a college football player. But are you, I guess we'll start here simply, are you now a converted fan of the Longhorns? Is that possible?
I have to be honest. I am, but I'm not. Publicly I would be. Publicly I would, be a fan. But then, the first of the season, LSU will play Texas here in Austin.
Uh-oh.
And I will not have any love towards Texas. But I'll be honest, it's hard to have that orange in me, though I was the chaplain and I speak to the team over the years regularly. I'm still an SEC guy. A&M is about an hour and a half away, so I think I just kind of keep it in the family when it comes to the Texas teams, and so A&M would win out.
I think that makes sense. I think especially LSU and having played college football there, I think that's where your roots were found. So walking around with an LSU shirt isn't going to get you any trouble in Texas, right?
Not really. There's a lot of LSU people here in Austin, actually.
Okay.
When the hurricane in 2004 came to New Orleans and kind of put a lot of people over this way, and Houston. And so there is in fact, I think the largest LSU alumni association is Austin, Texas. And so we're okay. But I do have a lot of friends within the Texas world. Coaches like Mac Brown, very good friends of mine, still are. Yeah. So I gave him a shout out, but that's about as far as I go.
Now, you're a pastor now. Obviously, sports is a huge part of your life and was a huge part of your life growing up. Tell us about that, kind of when you're a kid. Take us back to those early days and how sports was sort of shaped and formed in your life.
Well, I was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and that was way back in 1964. My dad was with the BC Lions.
Oh yeah.
My dad had went to Mississippi State, played football in the Old American Football League, then went into coaching high school in Mississippi, and then Mississippi State as a coach, and then Canadian Football League, and then in '64 I was born when they won the Grey Cup, and then Dad from the BC Lions, he went to the St. Louis Cardinals in the '60s. Then came back to Vancouver as the head coach. Then we moved to New Orleans with the Saints, and then St. Louis with the Cardinals, and then New York with the Jets, and then Atlanta with the Falcons, and with Green Bay with the Packers. So football, that was our whole world. That's what my dad did for a living. I didn't know anything other than that. Then my dad retired. We moved to a small town outside of Natchez, Mississippi, where my mother is from. My dad and mom retired there. I went to a small private school in Louisiana. Then that's how I became interested in LSU. My first college was Southeastern. I actually signed out of high school to Southeastern Louisiana University. Then I transferred to LSU. Bill Arnsberger and my dad were friends when they were both in New York. Bill Arnsberger was the head coach for the Giants, and Dad was with the Jets with Lou Holtz. And that relationship they had, and then they needed what I did, which was a long snapper. I played offensive tackle and then also a long snapper. But Bill said, I need a long snapper, so I transferred to LSU in '85. And that's how we ended up in spending 20 years of my life in Louisiana.
It's just you describing how you moved around a lot as a kid with your dad, going to all these different cities and coaching. What was that like as you look back now? I'm guessing as a kid, you're just thinking, well, maybe you're not. I'm thinking this is the coolest thing ever. My dad's a coach and I get to go to all these cities. But I also know from having a kid myself, a daughter who's now 14, she doesn't like moving. She doesn't want to move because her friends and her roots are in a certain place. What was that like for you experiencing that?
It would be bittersweet. There would be days like the time I remember moving from New Orleans to go to St. Louis, and I was in the second grade, and I can just remember on the side of the house just crying, sitting on the side of the house by myself crying. And then my mom come walking around, and she said, "What's sad?" And I said, "Well, of course we're moving again. Of course, NFL stands for not for long." And so right. Then she said, "But look what's going to happen. We're going to move to a new city. You're going to have new friends." And my mother was the one that made, as any coach's wives and all coaches will tell you, they make or break the family when it comes to this business, and especially the moving, which is just going to be a part of it. But I also can tell you that it was a part of God's plan, not just for me, but my brother, who is a retired 2-star general. He spent most of his high school, in fact, all of his high school years were in Canada. And my dad was given the defensive coordinator job for the Saints. Well, my brother only had half of a year left before he would graduate in Canada from his school. But my dad refused to let my brother stay in Canada, and he literally just forced him. It came kicking and screaming, made him come to New Orleans with the family. Then he would graduate from high school in New Orleans, and then he would go on to Ole Miss. And I say that to say this, that my brother then would go on and have this, literally, he's the most decorated commanding officer in the history of the National Guard. No one has more combat active duty command than my brother as a National Guardsman. Now, had my dad let my brother stay in Canada, my brother tells me today, he would have never come to America. And the destiny of my brother made history literally by being obedient to my father. or by trusting my father's direction. And I will say in the same way that behind every move, you know what? God had a plan. God had a purpose, and it just made me better. It gave me a worldview. It made me adjust. It made me flex. It made me meet new people. And that's how my mom and dad approached every move, even though it was not easy, even though it was embarrassing. I'm grateful for every place that we ever lived. And that's what I tell parents this all the time, that your move, you may not have much support from home, but your move literally will contain the future of your kids and will have an impact on them forever. So don't be sad. And then I tell the kids, your parents are making a hard decision or having to make that job change, but you know what's going to turn out to be the best things that ever happened if you just trust.
Joe Champion's our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. He's the pastor of Celebration Church in Austin, Texas. So you are a pastor. When does Jesus start to become a part of your life and come into the picture for you?
The first time I ever heard the gospel, it was training camp of 1978. It was Furman University, where at that time the Falcons would go and have their training camp. And two football players, two linebackers, longtime NFL players, Greg Berzina and Ralph Ortega, after practice one day said, "We need to talk to you tonight. We need you to come to our room after you're finished with your ball boy experiences and duties." And so I went up into their room, and there was Ralph and Greg with a Bible in their hand, and they said, "Joe, I'm 14," and they said, "We would like to tell you about Jesus. We want to tell you about what he did for you and us and the whole world." And just there, they just laid out the gospel for about 2 hours right in front of me for just as clear as it could be. The next week, they took a trip. I didn't make the trip, but they came back from a preseason game. The Bible that, in fact, I still have it on my shelf here. It's a Bible that Ralph and Greg gave me. That night, I prayed to receive Christ at 14, never having been to church, never having gone to church before. My mom and dad were not religious, didn't in fact believe in any kind of, as they would describe it, organized religious gathering. My mom was from a Catholic background. My dad was from a Baptist background, but I was born to be their bartender, as they tell me. Yeah. And my brothers were not as well, raised in church. But these two players took the time during training camp, during the most intense time of their season, would share the gospel with this 14-year-old boy at the time. And I just remember believing, but I didn't have a church home. And that seed, though, was sown. I truly believe I was marked and saved even from that moment on, the reality of who Jesus was, a personal relationship to him. Then fast forward, I'm at LSU. And that's where my junior year things would begin to take off for ministry. But the first time I heard the gospel was at training camp with the Atlanta Falcons.
So there's a couple things here. I'm picturing being a 14-year-old kid myself, 9th grade or so. My daughter's 14 now. And you're at training camp. Number one, that's pretty awesome. Obviously, your dad's coaching. Number two, these guys are saying, "We need to talk to you tonight." You're thinking probably, I'm in trouble, right? At that point.
I'm in trouble. I thought I was cussing. I mean, I had a bad mouth, and I thought they were going to tell me, "If you don't stop cussing, we're going to tell your dad." Or like the rest of the ball boys, we snuck out stuff all the time. If you know, you've been in locker rooms and around those experiences. There's chewing tobacco. You can get all the skull you want. You can have all the Red Man you want. Yeah. There's a lot of cool things. There's all the T-shirts. I mean, there's a lot of merch out there. And, of course, a lot of balls. I remember having 15, 20 balls at my house at any given time, taking care of my friends. So I thought, oh, Lord, they've seen me take something. And so anyway, thank God it was the gospel is what they really wanted to bring to me.
Amen. But what about, you say your parents weren't religious or didn't really have a background in that way. Did you tell them after this experience happened? And what was the reaction?
And they were not anti that. I will say they were never. In fact, they probably would have said, "They're right. You need to listen to what they had to say."
Right.
So they would never discourage anyone from wanting to bring me to church. In fact, I jokingly say, had anyone pulled up, it could have been a Hare Krishna, it could have been a Buddhist, it didn't matter. If anybody pulled up and said, "Hey, you need to come to this church or this religious temple, get in, we'll take you," my parents would have probably said, "Go on, just have at it. Just see what you can go and find out, explore. So in that way, they would have never discouraged, nor would they have ever come back around and have said to Greg or Ralph, hey, we don't want you talking to our son about that. Now, I will say that they were probably more permissible, but at the same time, I think they knew Greg, and I know my dad knew Greg and knew Ralph, that they were the real deal. And they probably, in fact, I remember having various things over the years, like the Chicago Bears came down and spent a week of training camp during practices. And the FCA, I'd go to the FCA meetings and vividly remember sitting next to Walter Payton. I didn't bring my Bible to the meeting, but there was Walter. I sat next to him, and he said, hey, why don't you share my Bible with you? So little things like that, my dad was always very encouraging, especially if FCA, to go in and get involved to any of those kind of meetings. That's
awesome. Now, when you get to LSU, you mentioned that ministry started to take shape, and sort of the clarity of the gospel and kind of your path started to take shape. Share with us that moment and kind of how things started to really look forward for you in Christ at LSU.
Yeah, it was my junior year in particular, and I know that I'm saved, but I'll confess, you have you just are still. It took Israel 40 years to get out of Egypt.
That's right.
And so I'm out of slavery, but I'm not out of Egypt. I'm still in that wilderness and that wandering period of time, and so it's coming into the full promises of God and crossing over that Jordan. Really happened what I would describe as January the 10th, 1987. We had just finished playing in the Sugar Bowl against Nebraska, and I was pretty much the team party captain. Mm-hmm. I was a special teams captain, but I was also the team captain when it came to parties, and especially in Baton Rouge and South Louisiana. It's a party atmosphere, and I did that well. My parents were very prolific in that environment as well. And it was January the 10th. I'm sitting on a deer stand. Actually, we had just come back from a game. My roommate was Ray Brock, whose brother was Pete Brock, played for the Patriots for 13 years. Stan Brock played, 17 years in the NFL with the Saints, and then would finish up with the Chargers. Willie Brock, he played for Kansas City. So anyway, the Brock brothers are very famous in the NFL world. And so we had just come back from the game watching Pete play against the Broncos. That was the week before Denver played against the Browns when Elway had the drive, the famous drive.
Sure.
So with that being said, I'm on this deer stand with my uncle Joe Fortunato, who played 13 years with the Chicago Bears. And Uncle Joe, that's who I'm named after. I'm about half a mile from where he is, and I'm on this deer stand about 3:00 in the afternoon. All of a sudden, I hear this thought, this phrase, call it the voice of God, an impression, but I just heard this: today will be the greatest day of your life, and you will never be the same after today. And I thought, I'm going to kill the world's largest deer today and travel all over the country and become famous. But I can literally remember saying, what is going to happen? Today will be the greatest day of your life, and you will never be the same after this day. I was planning on going out that night with my buddies. The night before, Dad and I had gone out for a few beers, and my uncle and I, we finished our hunt. I did take a deer out of the woods that day, and by the time we got that taken care of, got back to my uncle's house, my aunt was there at the door waiting to tell me, Joe, I just got off the phone with your dad, with your mom, and they're bringing your dad into the hospital. He's had a heart attack. Get in the car, make your way across the Mississippi River Bridge to Faraday, Louisiana, where the hospital is. And now we're just 3 hours later from being on the deer stand. And I can just tell you, the whole time driving there, I had this incredible peace that was over me and over this situation. Got to the hospital almost simultaneously as the ambulance was arriving. And I just remember saying to the Lord, in that little bathroom, actually, I just walked down the hallway and said, close the door. And I said, Lord, you've got it. I don't know if Dad's going to live or die today, but I heard you today. I believe you spoke to me, that you are in control. Today will be the greatest day of my life. I will never be the same. And I will say my dad died that day, January the 10th, 1987. Worst day of my life. But the greatest day of my life was also the worst day of my life. And that's the day that Christ became real. In not just real that I was going to heaven, but but that heaven was coming to me, and that there was a plan, there was a purpose for this, for more than just being saved. Now I'm being converted to my calling. And that's when I became serious. That's when I became one that wasn't just going to be a weekender believer or Christian, but I was going to fulfill the plan that God had for me, which now I know, not just on that day, but through the process of time, that I was called to ministry. I was called to speak. And then at my dad's funeral, which was interesting, just 3-4 days later, one by one, people at the funeral would say, your dad has been telling us for weeks that you're going to be a pastor one day. You're going to be a pastor one day. And went back to LSU January, I guess around January the 18th or whenever we went back for the spring semester. And I've never been the same since. Went back, and instead of organizing team parties, I organized FCA and what began as Tiger Church, which is still going on at LSU with hundreds of athletes. And God just began to just open up doors to speak and to travel and to share my testimony. And especially out of a day that arguably, in fact, the first funeral I ever went to was my dad's funeral. But I can just tell you, even to this day, the incredible peace that I have. And what I will say to anybody is that the voice of God is greater than any voice of death or the voice of a circumstance or a situation. And that's why I can tell you I'm not bitter, I'm not angry. I mean, if you could say, if God says today will be the greatest day of your life, you'll never be the same after this day, you would think that everything was going to be great.
Yeah.
It would be easy to interpret that as meaning I'm not going to have another problem. And certainly today won't be an issue. And all of a sudden, the biggest issue of them all is your dad is dying as a young college age boy, and who's your hero. But I can just tell you, through that, I just learned to trust God through the fires, through the floods, through the storms. And I'm just thankful that the Lord protected my heart from becoming bitter or angry. And now I know that even out of whatever happens in our lives, that he causes, it doesn't say he causes things, but it does say he causes good to come out of things. Yes. All things work together for good. It doesn't say all things are good.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't good. My dad died, but he made it good for me and for my family. And so that's what happened.
It's a great story. What's the greatest lesson you learned from your dad in your time that he was around? What's the greatest lesson he taught you?
Oh, man. Even though we were not a biblical family in a classical sense, but we were a very biblical family in the sense of honesty, in the sense of integrity, of hard work, of love. My dad is as tough as he was born in the Depression. My dad would find himself in the middle of Germany at 18 years of age, just a couple of weeks after graduated from high school. Went through what he went through in that war experience, like so many of that, what we call the greatest generation. And many of those guys, and as he did as well, suffered with ongoing PTSD challenges and issues, even with alcohol. But I never heard my dad say anything to me other than he loved me, he believed in me. And to the day he died, I could not go to bed. If I was at home, I could never go to sleep without telling him I loved him and giving him a kiss. And he said that. He goes, the day you can't kiss me or I can't kiss you and tell you that I love you is the day Santa Claus will never visit this house again. And so I can just tell you, as big and as tough and as rough as a man he was, an NFL football coach, but boy, was he one tender guy that just constantly affirmed me and told me how proud he was. And he never could say that enough. Oh, he was tough now. I mean, he was a believer in punishment, capital punishment, belt punishment, wind sprints. I mean, he'd wake me up at 5 o'clock in the morning. If I wasn't behaving myself, he'd wake up at 5 in the morning, have me out in the backyard running. But then, boy, he was all day long telling me how much he loved me. So that's the main thing, is I never lacked for confidence because of the Father's voice, my earthly Father's voice that was, even to this day, constantly in my ear. It is in my ear to this day.
So eventually you come to planting Celebration Church, and there's a time gap there of obviously between 87 and 2000 of you doing ministry. So take us through just the cliff notes of what was in between that time to leading you to plant Celebration Church in October of 2000.
Well, after I graduated from LSU in December of '88, I moved to New Orleans in '89 to go to seminary. So at that time, I thought I was going to be a chaplain in the military, but got rerouted. I just began to realize the influence and even what I believe was God's call upon my life was not going to be military route. So I went into pastoral ministry, youth pastor, became a co-pastor, then senior pastored in Louisiana for 5 years just outside of Baton Rouge. And then from 98 to 2000, I traveled full-time, speaking, doing conferences, based out of a local church in Baton Rouge, but traveled predominantly. Mm. And then in 2000, I just from 98 to 2000, began to just pray, Lord, I want to go to a city and plant a church if it's your will, but I want to be in a city that wants to change the world for whatever reason. And just tell us where to go. And where you tell us to go, we'll go there. And then, honestly, maybe the second dramatic day of my life was I heard this phrase, "It is Austin." And it just was so clear to me. And I told my wife, and she said, I had the same thought today. It was one day. Well, we would move Austin 5 months later, arrived August of 2000, and started the church with about 54 people the very first Sunday, half of those people from New Orleans that came over just to be with us that day. Yeah. Church got down to about 7 people. We were in just a rented room in the public library, and then we went to a hotel conference room. And then we went to a little industrial plex, 6,000 square foot building. And then out of that little 6,000 square foot building, we grew to about 1,000, 1,500 people. Then we bought about 110 acres on I-35. The church was growing. And I guess today about 15,000 people attend our church with several locations in Austin. And then also we have 12 locations in Africa. And we also have a campus outside of Naples, Italy, in Caserta. And so it's only by the grace of God this whole run for these last 18 years. It's not anything we do. We just show up, and He's good to just back up His gospel.
That's so awesome. A couple more questions here with Joe Champion. So it's obviously a faith and sports podcast. We've shared a lot of sports in your past. So how about now, other than you making sure that LSU is at the forefront of your rooting interests, but how does sports and faith intersect in your life today from a ministry standpoint?
Yeah, I still do quite a bit of different FCA events, whether that would be for college or for high school. I still enjoy pregame chapel services. I still enjoy a lot of the FCA opportunities I get to speak to banquets. My middle son, Connor, is on the staff with Herm Edwards at Arizona State University. Yeah, sure. As an assistant quarterback coach. He was with Dan Mullen for 2 years. Then he and Dak Prescott are still to this very day best friends. Then Connor went to the University of Houston with Applewhite as a result of Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson, who is now the quarterback coach with Dan Mullen at Florida, had gone to Houston. So Connor went with him to Houston. And then Connor felt like, Dad, I want to come on staff. Then Connor came on staff with us. Dan got the job with Florida. Connor still keeps in contact with those guys, but an opportunity opened up with Herm Edwards. And Kevin Mawai is one of my best friends. Kevin actually is on staff as an analyst who was just voted into the Hall of Fame. Yeah, sure. He opened up an opportunity for Connor to interview. And so Connor's now at Arizona State with Herm and Kevin Mawai and that group, and he's loving it there. So what I say from that angle is that a lot of friends are still in the industry. A lot of friends are in coaching. We have a lot of athletes from UT, a lot of athletes that are presently on the football team, a lot of coaches here with the Texas Longhorn organization. And then up and down I-35, we've got, of course, Texas State. We've got coaches and some players there. In fact, there's a coach that's on the staff with University of Texas San Antonio right now, actually staying at my house. He's a good friend of my son, Connor. So kind of keep our hand in it.
I guess so.
I just love it. And I have a lot of relationships with a lot of coaches now that my age is, I'm 54. Yeah. So I still hopefully keep keep fresh and young with a lot of players. But Austin has a lot of retired NFL guys as well. So we have a lot of retired NFL guys in our church that open up opportunities to speak or to maybe just give some biblical advice to players and coaches to this day.
How great is Herm Edwards? Because I worked with him for so many years. He's probably one of the best dudes I ever came in contact with and spent time with. How great is he, huh?
Connor just, in fact, they just had their spring game Thursday night. Then he flew back to be home here for an event. And he just said, what you see is what you get.
Yep.
But he just keeps saying, Dad, he is just the coolest man. And he's not a screamer. He's not a yeller. He's not of the system that you see so often in today's coaching world. And then he said, and even when he yells, which is really not yelling in comparison to some guys, he's like, hey, I'm sorry for yelling. And he's like, you yelled? I didn't know you yelled. And he'll tell you, he goes, this is a real serious staff when it comes to the Lord. And then also when it comes to how they treat people. It's really neat. And he really enjoys what he sees daily in being a part of the staff there at Arizona State. And then who comes to see Coach Herm. And even being in that Phoenix world, there's so many of the players that are training for combines or training for their future. He said it's pretty cool to be there on the staff.
Joe Champion's been our guest here. He's the pastor of Celebration Church in Austin, Texas. Joe, last question, and this has been great. Thank you for your time. What is the Lord teaching you right now? We ask this to all of our guests here on the podcast, and I think it's a great question to ask every type of guest that we have on. And for you, it's being a pastor. But what are you learning from the Lord during the season of life that you're in right now?
I guess in some ways that the Lord is faithful to bring to pass what he has told you he's going to do, or that work that he has started, he is going to complete. And so often we think that it's not going to come to pass to the degree or in the way that you thought, or the way that you've been believing that certain dreams or certain aspects of your life will happen. And if you're not careful, you can give up on that, or you can settle for less. And if you just don't quit, and if you don't give up, you're just going to have to allow, like the story of Abraham, how the Lord, he was 75, and he said, hey, you're going to have a son. Well, it wasn't until 99 years of age, almost 100 years old, 25 years later, that word came to pass.
Yeah.
And I just think that so many times we give up between the 75 to the 99. You just got to hang on. You got to show up, and you got to keep showing up. Half the battle is just showing up, just getting there. And so just getting to church, just getting to work, just getting to your knees, if you will, just getting to your Bible, just open it up, just start reading. And it's amazing when you just do that, how God he's faithful to perform what he's promised to perform, and to not grow weary in doing good. But, as he says, whatsoever a man sows, he will reap. Yeah. Just keep sowing good, and God is going to he's going to show himself faithful.
He is Joe Champion, the pastor at Celebration Church in Austin, Texas. If you're down in Austin, go check it out. And Joe, listen, this has been great to talk to you. Hopefully we'll have you back on. Hopefully I'll meet you in person and shake your hand. And just really thankful for your story. Thanks for sharing it and joining us here on the podcast.
Well, you're just doing an amazing work. We enjoy your podcast and the world that we have privilege of knowing. So many men, so many people are impacted by your work, Jason. And I just say, man, keep going, keep it on. And a lot of people are really being impacted by what you're doing. Thanks a lot.
And many thanks to Joe Champion, the pastor at Celebration Church in Austin, Texas. And it was very nice of him to say those things at the end of the interview. And I never know how to respond. Do you say, thanks so much, Joe? Or do you leave it in, or do you take it out? But I left it in, and I'm humbled and thankful for Joe for what he had to say. But even more, I'm thankful to him for coming on the podcast. I mean, how great of a storyteller is this guy? wow. I mean, coming to faith in Christ in 1978 by hearing the gospel in the training camp for the Atlanta Falcons. Are you kidding me? What a great story there. And then the story of the greatest day of his life and the worst day of his life being the same day. Just powerful stuff there on how his faith was strengthened and became real to him in the aftermath of the death of his father. Obviously, his father being his hero and being a longtime football coach in the CFL and the NFL. One thing that we didn't mention too much of, I think Joe mentioned it, was that his son is a coach now, Connor, at Arizona State with Herm Edwards and the great group of people they have over there. And Herm Edwards, just one of the best people you'll ever meet. So good idea here, not only to follow Joe Champion, who's pastoring at Celebration Church, but his son Connor, who's over at Arizona State and their football program. So many thanks to Connor, many thanks to Joe. So many thanks to Joe for joining us here on the podcast and sharing his story, his journey of sports and faith. Many thanks to Compassion International as well for sponsoring this podcast. We are so grateful to have them on board, and what great work they do releasing children from poverty. For $38 a month, you can release that child, that individual child that needs help, that needs hope, that is missing the basic essentials: food, education, medical care, and vocational training. Make that difference in a child's life by sponsoring them with Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum, and sponsor a child today. Thanks to Compassion, and thanks to you for listening. And make sure, if you have an opportunity, to go leave a review for this podcast on Apple iTunes. It's a great way when you leave a review to get the word out, let people know about this podcast. You can also check out our website at sportspectrum.com. That's really where all of our content is found. We have daily devotionals every day at 6 a.m. Eastern to get your day started right in the Lord. And you can also check out all of the articles on there, content that goes back more than 30 years. And that really stems from being the pillar of what this ministry is about, and that is our magazine. Sports Spectrum magazine has been around for 30 plus years and is still around today. And it's your chance now to subscribe to the Sports Spectrum magazine for what I think is a great deal, just $18 for an entire year. Get you 4 quarterly issues of the Sports Spectrum magazine, plus a couple bonus issues that we throw in periodically throughout the year. Check it out at sportspectrum.com. Subscribe today. You'll love the magazine. I promise you, you will want to read it and then give it to somebody else. It's that good. Check it out, sportspectrum.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum. Have a great rest of your day.